Hello, I'm Larry Cohen. I'm on the network of professionals for the Andrew Kukas Foundation for Social Anxiety. I'm co-founder of the National Social Anxiety Center, which has clinics around the country. And I've directed Social Anxiety Help, a clinic here in Washington, D.C. since 1990, where I've led more than 80 cognitive behavioral therapy groups for social anxiety. Today we'll be discussing two strategies for changing destructive thinking: cognitive restructuring and mindfulness. If at any time during this discussion you have a question, please submit it on the Periscope app so I can address it during the broadcast, or email me afterwards. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is based on the central principle that how we feel is greatly impacted by how we think. The situation itself doesn't cause our feelings, but how we think about a situation, along with our physiology, cause our feelings. Because of this, identifying and finding ways to modify destructive thinking is a key component of cognitive behavioral therapy. Let me illustrate with an example that's very relevant to social anxiety. Imagine someone named Tim, who is socially anxious, is invited by a good friend of his to a party. Normally he doesn't like going to parties, but this is a good friend of his, so he says yes, partly out of a sense of obligation. But Tim is feeling a great deal of anticipatory anxiety about the party. And he's thinking about telling his friend that maybe he's sick and can't go, making up reasons not to attend, but Tim decides to attend anyways. But on his way to the party, Tim's mind is flooded with destructive thoughts. I call them hot thoughts that are making him socially anxious. Thoughts like, I won't know what to say, I'll appear awkward, people will see that I'm nervous, I might say something stupid, and no matter what, I could end up making a bad impression that would embarrass me with these strangers, but also with my friend. As a result of these hot thoughts, Tim's social anxiety is intensified. But the cycle doesn't stop there. These hot thoughts and anxious feelings then result in what are called safety-seeking behaviors, which in Tim's case might involve avoiding eye contact or averting eye contact when someone does connect with him, not saying hello to new people, not introducing himself to new people, not joining conversations of people that are already in progress, staying off by the sideline, looking at his phone a lot rather than looking at people. And if somebody does come up and start a conversation with Tim, chances are Tim will be very much in his head rather than in the moment, focusing on more hot thoughts like, I just said something stupid, I don't know what to say next, what is this person thinking of me, can they tell that I'm nervous? And as a result, Tim probably is having a very awkward conversation, is speaking very little. These are examples of a vicious cycle that someone might experience that are caused in part by Tim's hot thoughts. Imagine someone else named Connie who is invited to the same party. And unlike timid Tim, confident Connie has learned how to overcome her social anxiety through working with a cognitive behavioral therapist. She still experiences a little social anxiety here and there, including going to a party such as this with lots of strangers, but she has learned various tools, in particular cognitive restructuring and mindfulness, to greatly reduce her social anxiety and have a much better experience most of the time. So prior to going to the party, confident Connie, who has the same hot thoughts as timid Tim, she, however, does cognitive restructuring using a worksheet before going to the party in which she identifies a constructive alternative way to think as a counter to her hot thoughts. And there's no one right answer, but what Confident Connie came up with are the constructive thoughts like the following. I know from experience that most of the time I talk with people that I make a perfectly good impression. Conversations go reasonably well. Sure, sometimes conversations have awkward moments, and every once in a while I might say something kind of stupid, but you know what? It doesn't seem to have a big impact. The conversation just goes on if I let it. And besides, other people sometimes say awkward or stupid things too. It's no big deal. And although not everyone seems to enjoy talking to me, most people do. And besides, I don't enjoy talking to everyone either, so it's all normal. This is an example of a constructive way to think that Connie came up with as a result of doing cognitive restructuring. Now, when she went to the party, she had also identified constructive behaviors as an alternative to her safety-seeking behaviors. So unlike timid Tim, Confident Connie made eye contact with people, smiled at people, said hello to people, introduced herself to some people, walked up and joined some groups that were already talking. And when she did speak, she focused mindfully on the conversation and on the people rather than on the negative thoughts in her head. She treated those thoughts like background noise. And Connie spoke a little more fluidly as a result, certainly more confidently, and the conversation went well. By the end of the party, poor timid Tim leaves feeling rather bad about himself. Not only did he have a rather bad time, but now he's feeling rather embarrassed and depressed, thinking that he's made a bad impression and thinking that he's just not up for this kind of thing, that he's not good at this. Whereas on the contrary, Confident Connie leaves the party feeling more confident than ever, realizing that not all the conversations went so well, but mainly they did, and it was evidence that she indeed can be perfectly enjoyable as a conversational partner. Now let's take a look at these two strategies in a little more detail. Cognitive restructuring is a way to identify and challenge hot thoughts, the thoughts that make us socially anxious or, in some cases, depressed. There's different ways of doing it. Let me describe using a worksheet, which will take you through a series of steps. The first step would be identifying the destructive thinking in the first place, the hot thoughts, as well as the self-defeating, safety-seeking behaviors. And we described those thoughts that both Tim and Connie had, as well as the behaviors that Tim engaged in because of his hot thoughts and anxiety. The next step is challenging the hot thoughts, and there's a couple ways of doing so. One is identifying cognitive distortions in the thoughts. Cognitive distortions are thinking errors. Two of the most common ones for social anxiety is perfectionistic thinking, also called all or nothing or black and white thinking. For example, the idea is either this conversation is really good or it's terrible. Either I make a good impression or I make a terrible impression. That's an example of perfectionistic or all or nothing thinking. Another common cognitive distortion with social anxiety that we might see in our hot thoughts is personalizing, assuming things are about us and because of us. For example, if someone doesn't seem to enjoy the conversation with us, or if a conversation doesn't flow or isn't fascinating, we might personalize that and take that to mean that I'm socially inept, that I'm an uninteresting person. Those would be examples of personalization. So identifying cognitive distortions, and there's a list of them that I could send you if you'd like, is one way to challenge hot thoughts. Another way, which is probably stronger, is to learn how to debate your hot thoughts, just like you might debate somebody else with whom you disagree about something. And there's a series of challenging questions that you can choose among to help you debate your hot thoughts. And again, I have that on a list that I'd be happy to send you. probably the two that I like the best, that I think most socially anxious people find useful. One is, what's the evidence supporting and refuting my hot thoughts? That's basically using the scientific method. So just like a scientist doesn't just believe his or her hypotheses to be true, but looks for evidence that either supports or refutes the hypothesis and then alters the hypothesis to fit the evidence, we can do the same with our hot thoughts. So in the case of Connie, she realized that actually most of the evidence is that the conversations she has usually go well. And when she says something stupid, first of all, it's very rare. And secondly, it tends to have minimal impact. Another challenging question that's often useful is to ask ourselves, what's the worst that can happen? What's the best that could happen? And what's the most likely thing that could happen? That helps us stay away from the extremes and have more realistic expectations of, in this case, how the party will go. So identifying distortions and debating your hot thoughts with challenging questions are two ways to weaken them. Finally, the goal of cognitive restructuring is the last part, to come up with a constructive alternative to your hot thoughts, a realistic and helpful response to them. I call them constructive thoughts, as well as a constructive alternative to your safety-seeking behaviors, which are simply behavioral goals that you would want to work on. And I gave example earlier of Connie's constructive thoughts and constructive behaviors. Now, there's different ways of doing cognitive restructuring. As I said, one way is a worksheet, which is probably the best way to learn this skill and the best way to practice it. It's also the most time-consuming way, so there are shorter ways as well. In writing, you can simply write down a constructive way to think on a file card or perhaps on your smartphone and carry that with you and look at it before the party and look at it again during occasional breaks, such as in the bathroom. There's also various apps that you can use on your smartphone or other devices that help you do cognitive restructuring. There are oral ways of doing cognitive restructuring through self-messaging, telling yourself the constructive attitude, the constructive way to think, just like a kindly friend would give us an encouraging set of messages. We can give ourselves these same messages orally, and we can record those messages on our phone and listen to them occasionally. Lastly, and for many people, most powerfully, there are experiential ways to do cognitive restructuring. So if you're fortunate enough to be doing cognitive behavioral therapy, with your therapist in session, you can do various types of role plays in which you are practicing debating your hot thoughts. Maybe you're doing a two-chair role play in which you're in one chair playing your hot thoughts and in another chair playing your constructive way to think, and you're going back and forth until you feel much stronger about your constructive attitude. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, you can conduct behavioral experiments to test your hot thoughts, just like a scientist conducts experiments to test his or her hypotheses. And Connie did this by going to the party, and she found through testing her hot thoughts at the party that indeed the evidence was that most people enjoyed talking with her, and that most of the time she had things to say, and that seldom did she say anything stupid, and when she did, it didn't seem to make any difference. So those are all examples of how to do cognitive restructuring in writing, orally, or through experience. Mindfulness is a very different way of changing hot thoughts. Unlike cognitive restructuring, which is about changing the content of hot thoughts, mindfulness doesn't deal with the content of our hot thoughts at all, but it's changing our relationship with our hot thoughts. There's an expression I like that sort of signifies what mindfulness means. Get out of your head and into the moment. By being in your head, I mean focusing on your negative thoughts, your unpleasant feelings. Being in the moment, I mean focusing on the conversation and the activity that's going on right then and there. Now, there's different ways of practicing mindfulness. Most people think of meditation as mindfulness, and I want to stress that is not the case. Meditation is simply one way to practice mindfulness, but for social anxiety purposes, meditation is actually not very useful, research has shown. Meditation is very useful for other problems, don't get me wrong, but research shows that even placebos do better than meditation for social anxiety. However, mindfulness practice during interactions is essential for social anxiety, and research confirms this. I call this type of practice, this type of using mindfulness during interactions, I call that curiosity training. Because mindfulness means paying attention to something in the present moment, in this case a conversation or activity when we're anxious, paying attention to it with curiosity. In other words, taking interest in it, as opposed to evaluating it, or more likely, evaluating ourselves. Now that takes practice. It's a simple concept, but it is not easy to do when we're anxious. When we're anxious, we typically go very much into our heads. So I advise clients to practice mindfulness every day through curiosity training, to go out of your way to interact with people every day, not only in situations in which you're anxious. Actually, in the beginning, it's best to practice when you're not very anxious, and gradually practice in situations in which you're more and more uncomfortable. And what you're practicing is returning your attention back to the conversation, the person, the activity, in that very moment, whenever you slip into your head. And what you do with your negative thoughts and feelings is treat them like background noise. We don't have the ability to turn our thoughts and feelings off, and if we try to do that, it tends to backfire and strengthen the thoughts and feelings instead. But we do have the ability to nudge them gently into the background and treat them like so much noise, meaning something that we're aware of but not paying attention to. So notice that Connie did cognitive restructuring before she went to the party. She identified goals that she wanted to do during the party so that the party became an experiment for her to test her hot thoughts. And during the party, she very much practiced mindful focus, taking interest, being curious about people and the conversations. Now, some people who are proponents of mindfulness say that cognitive restructuring is self-defeating and we should not do that. I absolutely disagree. I think both cognitive restructuring and mindfulness are very useful techniques. Most people in my experience, including myself, find both of them very useful, but in different ways and in different times. Typically, there are exceptions. Typically, cognitive restructuring is useful for before or after a situation we are socially anxious about, when we're worrying about it beforehand, or ruminating or beating ourselves up about it afterwards. During a situation, mindfulness tends to be the most useful. Thank you for tuning in to the Andrew Kukas Foundation Periscope series today. I'm Larry Cohen. If you'd like to connect with me about any of the information we discussed, you can reach me at larrycohen@socialanxietyhelp.com. For more information or resources about social anxiety, please visit AKFSA.org and follow AKFSA on Facebook and Twitter for regular updates. Don't hesitate to contact me, please. Thank you.